In this chapter, we're going to talk about the integumentary system. The integumentary system does consist of skin, which, remember, is a cutaneous membrane. But there are other components of it also. For example, sweat glands are part of the integumentary system. Oil glands. In addition, hair and nails are all part of the integumentary system. Skin itself makes up a significant part of the body. It's around anywhere between 7 to 16% of the body weight of an adult. So, for example, if someone weighs 130 pounds, their skin weighs about 9 pounds. So as a rough approximation, think of holding 2 5-pound bags of sugar. That's essentially the weight of skin. So what's the purpose of skin? Well, there are many functions, but the main function of skin is to protect underlying organs. And it protects them from a number of things. First of all, mechanical damage. Mechanical damage refers to when you bump or scrape up against something with your skin. The reason that it doesn't fall off or tear is because of a protein called keratin that's in your skin that conveys hardness to your skin. Keratin's also found in hair and nails. It's very tough, as I said, insoluble, and it protects the surface. Another thing your skin protects you from is chemical damage. And, for example, from acids and bases, things that are very corrosive. The way that your skin does this is that it consists of many layers. So if the first couple of layers are damaged, you've still got plenty underneath. But in addition to that, you have keratin. So this goes back to keratin again. Keratin doesn't let much through. So an example of protection, if you've ever washed, for example, a blouse in the kitchen sink and put some bleach in there, your fingers might have felt kind of slippery. That slipperiness is actually several layers of the skin sloughing off because the bleach is fairly corrosive. However, you have many other layers to protect the underlying organs. Not everything is protected, so your skin can't protect you from all chemicals. For example, arsenic is a human carcinogen and causes skin cancer. Your skin can't protect you from that. And there are many other chemicals that also cause skin cancer. Another thing that your skin protects you from is bacterial damage. So as long as the skin is unbroken, bacteria and other organisms, microorganisms, can't get through. However, there is also on the top layer an acid. So there is an acid layer on the top of your skin. And what that does is it inhibits bacterial growth. And that's actually excreted through some of the glands that are on your skin. They call that an acid mantle. Your skin also protects you against thermal damage, and this would be from extreme heat or cold. And it does this in a couple of ways. First of all, there are sensory nerve endings in your skin. So if it's very cold, you'll get a message to the brain that it's cold, and you'll warm up your extremities, your hands or your feet, perhaps. And likewise, if it's very hot. The other thing is that there are blood vessels in your skin. So when it's very cold, the blood vessels constrict, and that way keep the heat in the core of the body. So again, when it's cold, blood vessels constrict. And that keeps the heat in the core of the body. When it's hot, on the other hand, the blood vessels in the surface of your skin dilate, or they enlarge. And this brings all of the hot blood from the center of your body up to the surface where it cools off, and then it circulates back down again. So you have like a little heat air conditioning system going on. So that's how the skin protects your body from thermal damage. Ultraviolet radiation comes from the sun. There are different types of ultraviolet radiation, but UVB is known to cause skin cancer. So this is called ultraviolet B. Radiation can cause skin cancer. In your skin, in the cells of your skin, is the nucleus. And what UVB can do is it comes from the sun. If it gets to the nucleus, it can damage the DNA by causing single-strand breaks to the DNA, or even double-strand breaks. And this can lead to cancer as the cell divides. But in the skin is a protein called melanin. And melanin is actually a pigment. And what this pigment does is it forms an umbrella over the nucleus. And in that way, it screens out the UVB and prevents it from getting to the nucleus. And so that's how your skin protects you from ultraviolet radiation. Another thing your skin protects you from is desiccation. Just going to erase this for a second. Desiccation. Desiccation means drying out. So your body is about 70% water. And if there wasn't some way to waterproof your skin, you would quickly dry out. Well, in the skin, of course, you have keratin, the protein that we said conveys toughness, but it also slows water loss. And then you have some other things in your skin called lamellated granules. Lamellated granules, which also prevent water loss. Still, even with the keratin and the lamellated granules, we lose about 500 milliliters of water a day across the surface of our skin. That's about a pint of water. Your skin also helps in excretion of wastes. Urea and uric acid are metabolic wastes produced by most cells, and they are excreted onto the surface of your skin, usually through these ducts right here. And lastly, your skin synthesizes vitamin D. So in the skin, a reaction takes place. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun, UVB, combines with cholesterol to give you a form of vitamin D, an inactive form. The vitamin D then travels to your kidneys where it's activated. Vitamin D is kind of important. Although you get some in food, most of it is made in your skin. What you need vitamin D for is to allow uptake of calcium across your digestive tract. So it allows the uptake of calcium. I'm going to write Ca++ across your intestines. That's vitamin D. Allows the uptake of calcium across the intestines. So even if you're ingesting calcium, it's not going to be absorbed into your body unless you have vitamin D. And vitamin D synthesis begins in the skin. Now you might say, well, UVB is harmful, and the answer would be, at some levels, yes, but in small levels you actually need it to make vitamin D. So these are some of the things that the skin does. You can see it's fairly important. Now if we look at the skin, there are actually two layers. The most superficial layer is called the epidermis. And you might remember that epi, or maybe we haven't mentioned this, if epi is a prefix, it means above. So epidermis literally means above the dermis. The epidermis consists of stratified keratinized squamous epithelium. So remember, epithelium is on the free edge. Stratified means more than one layer. Squamous means the cells at the free edge are flat and thin. And keratinized means they're full of keratin. So if we look here, you can see the epidermis is just this top layer. right here, the epidermis. It's usually 4 or 5 layers, and there are 5 cell types, and it is hardened by keratin. Now, deep to this is actually the dermis. And the dermis consists of areola connective tissue over dense irregular connective tissue. So if we look at this model, at the very top here, they call it the papillary layer. You can see how thin it is. The top of the pink layer here is the areola. And then the majority of the dermis is actually made of dense irregular. And you might remember looking at the scalp slide, and when you did, when you looked at the dermis, you were looking at it for dense irregular connective tissue, and you were pretty much looking at the dermis. The areola is very difficult to see. So what are some of the cells of the epidermis? Well, the first type of cell is called a stem cell. Stem cells. And these produce most of the cells of the epidermis. They're found near the bottom layer of the epidermis. Stem cells are constantly going through mitosis, and as they do, they produce new cells. Now, the cells that they're producing are actually called keratinocytes. Keratinocytes. And as you might guess, they produce the protein keratin. In fact, most of the epidermis is made up of keratinocytes. Another type of cell is melanocytes, and melanocytes produce the pigment melanin. The melanocytes release the pigment melanin in something called a melanosome, which then moves to the keratinocytes, where the keratin is taken up into the melanin is taken up into the keratinocyte. So remember what the melanin does again. If this is a cell and there's the nucleus, it covers the nucleus almost like an umbrella. And that prevents UVB from damaging the nucleus. Another type of cell found in the epidermis is called a dendritic cell. It's also called Langerhans cells. After Dr. Paul Langerhans, who was a German anatomist from 1847 to 1888. These are actually macrophages. And so if you might remember back to biology, macrophages are cells that engulf and destroy either debris, cellular debris, or bacteria or other types of pathogens. They also activate the immune system. So these cells are constantly on patrol throughout the epidermis, looking for pathogens or harmful microorganisms. Another type of cell found in the epidermis is called a tactile cell. It is also called a Merkel cell. After Dr. Friedrich Merkel, who was another German anatomist. These function as light touch receptors, and they are only found in hairless skin. When they're compressed and when pressure is put on the surface of the skin, they release a chemical that stimulates sensory nerve endings in the skin. Now, I might mention that in this example here, we had a couple of cells that have two names. One is a functional name that actually is related to what the cell does. The other is a name, it's called an eponym. And an eponym is when something is named after somebody, usually the person who discovered it. And you'll find as we go through this course, I'm going to give you both the eponym and the functional name. Anatomists are moving away from using eponyms, but a lot of people still do, so this way you'll know both. Okay, so now we know about the cells of the epidermis. How about let's take a look at the cells of the epidermis. And here's a drawing. So if we look at the first one, the stem cells, those are found right down here at the very bottom. So these cells here are actually the stem cells, right down here. Now you'll notice this pink area is called the dermis. Remember, that is deep to the epidermis. Here is the free edge at the top. And so these cells, the stem cells, are really at the bottom of the epidermis. This is where mitosis is happening. The cells are rapidly dividing. And the reason they are is because they are close to a source of oxygen and nutrients. So remember, the epidermis does not have any blood vessels. So the cells have to get their oxygen and nutrients from the dermis, which is well vascularized. And so that's why you've got the mitosis happening here. As these cells divide, the new cells just move up. And so as cells are produced, they keep moving up, 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 up that way. Now, keratinocytes are pretty much everything you see here for the most part. And you can tell that these cells really are flat and thin, and so that's where the stratified squamous definition comes from. Again, they make up most of the epidermis, and you can see the keratinocytes are connected. There's little connections between them. Those are desmosomes. Remember, desmosomes are anchoring junctions, so these hold the skin cells together because they're often being stretched and pulled. Another cell, the melanocyte, is right here. And remember, this makes melanin, which is then released and taken up by the keratinocytes. So these little dots that you see, the little brown dots you see within the keratinocytes, that's the melanin. The dendritic or Langerhorn cell is right over here. Remember, this is a macrophage that's constantly on the move, looking for pathogens. And then the tactile or Merkel cell is this one right here, the blue one. And you notice it is hooked up with a sensory nerve ending. So most epidermis has 4 layers. And when it has 4 layers, it is the thin skin. Epidermis that has 5 layers is actually making up thick skin, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's look at each of these layers of the skin now, because we said there's 4 to 5 layers. Well, the deepest layer is called the stratum basal. This is stratum is layer, basal is bottom. So this is the deepest layer. It is right next to the dermis and is firmly attached to the dermis. And this consists of a single row of stem cells. So we just looked at the stem cells, but the single row is called the stratum basal, and this is where you have rapid cell division going on. The next several layers up are called the stratum spinosum, and these are keratinocytes again, but they're starting to flatten. The keratinocytes contain melanin granules. This is where you find the dendritic cells on patrol also. If we keep moving up towards the free edge, we come to the stratum granulosum. This is generally 3 to 5 layers of flattened cells, and at this point the cells are the organelles at least are starting to deteriorate, and part of the reason for that is they are accumulating keratin. And as they accumulate keratin, the cell starts to die. But the other reason it's moving is it's deteriorating is the cell is further from the source of nutrients and oxygen, which remember is in the dermis. So we're moving away from that. Now in this layer you'll notice it's called granulosum, and the reason is you can see granules under the microscope inside the cell. And there are 2 types of granules. By the way, both of these are made by the keratinocytes, these granules. The first type of granules is called a lamellated granule. Whoops. And lamellated granules are glycolipids. So they are helping to make the skin water resistant. The other type is called a keratohyalin granule. And these help to form keratin in the upper layers of the epidermis. Now there are different types of keratin. Some types convey much firmer consistency than other types. So in the stratum granulosum, again, you're going to see granules inside the cells, and these are what they consist of. Now, if we keep moving up, we're going to come next to the stratum corneum. But before we do, let's look at a picture here of the skin layer and see if we can label the layers. So again, we've got the dermis down here in pink, and then the single layer of cells that are lining the dermis are called the stratum basal layer. That's where the cells are actively dividing. If we move up a little bit, from here to here, we have the stratum spinosum. And again, you can see the cells connected by the desmosomes. You can see the keratin inside, the keratinocytes. Sorry, you can see the melanin, that's the melanin. If we move up a little bit more, we have the stratum granulosum. And if you look carefully, let's see, we'll zoom in on this. You can see the granules inside the cell here. You can see the granules inside. And so a lot of those are for waterproofing the skin, but also for forming keratin in the upper layers. Now the next layer we're going to look at is the stratum corneum, but let's first look at a picture, a real photomicrograph, which is what you're going to be looking at. So again, here's the dermis. And if I said find the stratum basal, well, all you have to do is trace that one layer of cells that is lining the dermis, stratum basal layer. Stratum spinosum looks like it's from about here to here. Stratum granulosum is about here, and then stratum corneum is from here to the free edge. There's the free edge. Now there's nothing really specific about the stratum spinosum that would help you identify it, but you can definitely find the stratum basal layer because it's a single layer that lines that's against the dermis, and you can usually find the stratum granulosum because you can see that the granules stain a lot darker in this region. So if you can find the stratum granulosum and you can find the stratum basal, then all you have to remember is that between it is the stratum spinosum. So that's one strategy that might help a little bit. Okay, in thick skin, you have one extra layer instead of 4. You've got 5, and that's called the stratum lucidum. Now, lucid is a word that means clear, and so this layer actually is clear. It might look light or a very light purple under the microscope. It's between the stratum granulosum and the stratum corneum. And these cells are all dead. Now you only find this in thick skin. And thick skin is only found on the palms of the hand, on fingertips, and on the soles of the feet. So let's take a look at a couple of different slides and practice identifying the layers. So if we look up to this slide first, take a look right here. You can see the dermis, which is all along here. So everything underneath here, this is all dermis. So if I said find the stratum basal, well, it's the single layer of cells, and here you can pretty much see the nuclei, the single layer of cells that lines the dermis. Now, the next thing that's easy to find is the stratum granulosum, and you can see it's this dark purple layer right about here, and that means between the stratum basal and the stratum granulosum, you've got the stratum spinosum. Here, the stratum lucidum looks like a very light purple layer, so it's a little tricky here. And then, of course, up from here up to the top is the stratum corneum. Now, just a few things here. The stratum corneum, you can see these big white areas, and it's where the tissue has ripped apart. So a lot of times in the stratum corneum, you are losing layers. That's normal, especially on the surface of the skin, and you'll see the tissue start to separate. Because of desmosomes connecting the cells, the tissue separates in sheets instead of in individual cells. Let's look over here at another example. This is actually thick skin also. And again, you can see the dermis. There's the edge of the dermis, so the dermis is all down here. Stratum basal would be the single layer of cells right there. Stratum granulosum is this part here that's really, really dark, right there. And so stratum spinosum must be between the stratum basal, the single layer, and the stratum granulosum. Now right in here you'll see a very light area. That is the stratum lucidum. It's a little different than the other slide. From here to the surface is the stratum corneum. Okay, one more slide here. This is thick skin also, and this looks like a lot of the slides we have. So down at the bottom you can just see the outline of the dermis, some more dermis right here. So the single layer against the dermis is the stratum basal. The stratum granulosum you might be able to see right along here. It's a little bit of granules. And so everything between must be the stratum spinosum. Now here the stratum lucidum is clear. You see someone wrote SL. It is clear. Stratum lucidum. And then from here to the top is the stratum corneum. And you can see there's tears in it. So it's good to practice this, to look at slides as much as you can. The last layer, which is the most superficial of the skin, is the epidermis. And this is also the thickest layer of the epidermis. It's composed of completely dead cells, and they are full of keratin. This is also a protective layer. It is always rubbing off, constantly rubbing off. But remember, it rapidly regenerates. So the layer of the stratum corneum is essentially the layer of skin. This is where you get protection from abrasion, waterproofing, protection against microbes and chemicals, etc. So let's take a look at one more slide of the stratum corneum. And you can see again the outline of the dermis. So this is all the dermis. If I said find the stratum basal, it would be the single layer of cells that lines the dermis. The dermis. You can see right here, the stratum granulosum. The cells are dark purple. And so between the two, the stratum granulosum and the stratum basal, that's where you have the stratum spinosum. Now stratum lucidum is it's hard to see here, but we would be finding it right around here. And then of course from here to the surface is the stratum corneum. Here again you can see that when tissue in the stratum corneum falls off, it does so in sheets. And again, that's because of the desmosomes that hold cells together. Believe it or not, it takes about 7 to 10 days for a cell to make it from the stratum basal layer all the way to the stratum corneum. About 7 days to make it there, so you're not all the way up there. Keep in mind that cells near the bottom are actively dividing. So they're going to move up as more cells are made, and they're going to flatten as they get more towards the top. The entire epidermis is replaced every 25 days. So the entire epidermis is replaced every 25 to 45 days. So you get a complete new epidermis. Remember that it is also avascular. Just a reminder, which means no blood vessels. This is why when men shave and women shave, even though they're scraping off several layers of cells, they don't bleed because there's no blood vessels. To get an idea of how thick skin it is, think about a paper towel. A paper towel is probably the width of thick skin. Thin skin is the width probably of one side of a plastic baggie.